Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africa Fire Mission's weekly virtual training session. My name is Mike. I'm a project coordinator here with Africa Fire Mission, and we're so appreciative of you taking the time out of your schedules to come and join us for today's training. Today, we're joined by James Nyadwe. He's one of our Kenyan instructors. He does a great job with us. He's got a really wide background in all sorts of aspects of emergency services. We're so happy that he's here today to join us and share that knowledge with us. If you stick around for at least 70% of today's presentation, which is usually about 40 or 45 minutes, we will send you a certificate of attendance. Be sure you got your name set there on the Zoom. If you're watching with some other people on the screen, you can email Leah at africafiremission.org, and she'll take care of getting certificates for all the people that are watching with you. Before we get started with today's class, I'm going to pass it over to Jose, Africa Fire Mission's fire safety advocate, for a few words of encouragement.
Thank you so much, Chief Mike. Thank you so much, James, for tuning in. We truly appreciate you. And also thank you for tuning in. Just hold a little bit. So basically, sorry about that, it was a few interruption. For me, I'm just appreciative that you got to tune in, and also that everything is going on well with you. So just for some few seconds, I just want to encourage you and tell you that the small things that you do in the firehouse, or the small drills that you get to do every day, eventually piles up. You know, for example, if you're doing ladder work, or you're doing hose management, maybe you might just do it for like 10 minutes. Don't feel like you're not doing anything, you know. Just consistently getting to do something every time or every day at your station, you get to increase your skill. And by the time you get onto the fire ground, you will remember the small bits that you've been putting up together to actually get to either save somebody or even become better in doing the work as you serve people. So my encouragement of today is just do small things in the work, in the fire station, and don't feel like you're not doing anything. Through that, you get to compile all those skills for you to be better. Thank you very much. God bless you. Stick around. Back to you, Chief Mike.
And thank you, Jose. We always appreciate you coming to all the work that you do out there in the community and to support your fellow firefighters. I invite everybody to stick around afterwards. After today's training is complete, Jose will be hosting a tea time where you can ask questions about today's training or anything else that may be on your mind. Also, keep an eye in the chat. I'll be posting a link to our Google Drive where you can rewatch today's training or watch any of the trainings that we've done previously this year. And if you do watch those trainings through that link, answer a few questions about the training, you can receive a certificate of attendance for classes that may have missed earlier in the year. So keep an eye out in the chat for that. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to James to begin today's training session about HazMat Awareness. Take it away, sir.
All right, thank you, Chief Mike. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everybody else, for showing up today. So it's a good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our folks out there, depending on which part of the world you're tuning in from. So today we're going to look at HazMat Awareness. So just remember, as we look at this, we are talking about just the awareness, not really the operations. So the operations will come at a later stage, but for today, we're just going to look at the HazMat Awareness. So I hope everybody can see my screen.
All good.
If you got it up? Okay,
yep.
All good. So we're going to look at HazMat Awareness. So this will just give us a brief overview of what HazMat is and what the things we can do if we're trying to set up a team. So here it goes. So these are some of the objectives you're going to look at when we talk about HazMat Awareness. So we're going to define hazardous materials and hazardous waste. We're going to distinguish between a regulation and a standard. We're going to describe the roles and responsibilities of the awareness level, the operations level, technician level, and also specialist level. As you can see, as we go through the presentation, you'll see there's different levels to HazMat Awareness. So we're starting at like step one, and there's other stages that we look at. Then we're going to describe the roles and responsibilities of hazard materials and hazard material safety officers. Then we'll also look at the roles of hazardous material technicians with specialties, but again, it's slightly different. Then we look at the difference between hazardous material incidences and our normal emergencies. And then finally, we'll explain the need for a planned response to a hazardous incident, right? As you can see there, the picture there, that's a tanker on fire, which, you know, in the African scene, we tend to have a lot of those these days, but we'll see what we can do. So overview, as a firefighter, at times you may be called to incidences that involve chemical spills or emergencies at industrial plants, or, you know, the railroads, because now you see most countries have the railroads where the trains where they're pulling chemicals with the wagons, or they're pulling fuel with the wagons. So in case of a derailment, then again, you have a fuel spill or a fire, chemical fire. So these incidences, they threaten our life, property, and also the environment. So we'll start with the basic. What's a hazardous material? So it's a material that poses an unreasonable risk to the health and safety of the people and the environment if it's not properly controlled. So the range, it can be anything, you know, and these hazardous materials can be found anywhere. You look at your own houses, or even your workplaces or your offices, you have chemicals in there. If in a fire, these chemicals were to catch fire, then it would create a pose of a hazardous environment. So we'll use the example of the States, America. So there's more than 80,000 chemicals registered for use in commerce in the US, right? And then every year, there's 2,000 new chemicals being introduced. So there's a lot of stuff out there that can, you know, harm you as a firefighter. So we've looked at hazardous material, something that poses an unreasonable risk to the health and safety of the people, the environment, if it's not properly controlled. Then we look at hazardous waste. So this is the material that remains after a process where it has been used, the material has been used, and then what remains is no longer pure. So this would be considered hazardous waste. So maybe in the process of making maybe a car battery, what remains after that would be considered the hazardous waste. So it can be just as dangerous as the pure chemicals. It could be a mixture of several different chemicals, which either can result in a hybrid substance, which is even worse than the original chemical itself. So either way, the hazardous material and the hazardous waste, these are both very dangerous or deadly to us as firefighters. So we look at the difference between regulations and then standards, because these are, again, two different things. So regulations are issued and enforced by governmental bodies. So if we're, again, I'll take an example that's probably everybody knows, the OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or the Environmental Protection Agency. We have these same organizations in our countries, but just with different names. So this would be the people issuing out regulations. And then standards now are issued by non-governmental agencies, right? Based on a consensus. So, for example, as firefighters, we all follow the National Fire Protection Association. So they have different standards that they issue. Like, for example, NFPA 472, which talks about standard for competence of respondents to hazardous materials or weapons of mass destruction incidents, which also they call the WMDs. And then also there's the other standard of NFPA 473, again, which also deals with the emergency medical services personnel who report to the same incidences. So regulations, governmental bodies, standards, non-governmental entities. For example, like now, if it was in Kenya, the chief fire officers would have, once they form that organization, then they'll be able to issue standards based on to help us as we carry out our duties. So regulations and standards. Right? So different levels of training. Right? So the primary objective of the hazardous material response team is to provide guidance and technical expertise in the mitigation and removal of hazardous substances. So according to the NFPA, the levels are awareness level, which is what we're doing today, operations level, technician level, technician with specialty, and then incident commander. And then after that, they have two other ones, but for today, we'll just deal with this specific one. So we're looking at awareness level today. And in the course of the presentation, we'll also touch on operations, technician with specialty, and incident commander. So as you see there, most of you are very familiar with the pictures we have over here with the tankers and people trying to go and siphon fuel from the tankers. Unfortunately, usually ends up with a big disaster or in a big catastrophe. So let's see what's in awareness level. So awareness level responders. Basically, these are like our citizens, maybe police officers, security guards, your normal guys out there on the street. These are the people who will see what's happening and pass the information. So what do? You recognize a potential hazardous material incident. You're able to protect yourself. Most likely, they're the ones who witness or discover the hazardous substance. Then they call for trained personnel and secure the area. So as a fireman or a firefighter, if we were on the awareness level, then this is what we would do. We'd be able to recognize potential hazardous materials, either by knowing the location, maybe it was a hospital, or it was a chemical factory, a paint factory, a leather factory, that sort of thing. So we know obviously here we will encounter some hazardous material. Then we should be able to protect ourselves. Then obviously we are the witness to it, and we know, okay, for example, you know, they've got storage, they've got leather in there, they've got glue. Then we'd call for trained personnel and would secure the area, meaning that now we block it off so no one else can go into the area. So that's on the basic level, that's what the awareness level responders would do. So from that, we go to the operation level responders, okay? Often professional firefighters, and arrive on the scene after the 911 call has been given or the 999 call has been notified. So pretty much this group, their role is to analyze the situation, decide if you need more resources, implement a strategy. So it could either be offensive, defensive, or non-intervention. Because at times, there's nothing really you can do. You just have to let it burn out, right? That's probably would be the safest thing to do. And then also evaluate the progress of the incident. So most of the time, they'll take a defensive strategy unless they're specifically trained in a specific offensive skill. Then again, also depends on what you have at hand. If you don't have the necessary tools or the necessary equipment to do that, then you're most likely just going to adopt that defensive posture, right? So for example, right, two firefighters may enter a facility, you turn off the valve remotely. Obviously, you've been guided by the plant personnel without getting into the product. So you're just shutting off the source. So there's no more of that chemical being dispersed into the air or chemical feeding the fire. But if there's a release of product, then we would need a defensive strategy. Yeah, so now what would happen in that situation as responders? You can get contaminated, you can get exposed. Then now we need HazMat technicians, right? So it follows a progression. So remember, when you go out to this sort of fires, we have to be very careful because they're not like our regular structural fires or just a regular straight fire that's burning wood or that other kind of material. So from there, we're moving up to the technician level responders. So these are HazMat techs, right? They have more training than the awareness and the operations level personnel. And then they can take a more aggressive role, yes? Because they have now chemical protective ensembles that kind of keep them safe when they can go actually into it and neutralize the cause of the release or the cause of the chemical spill. So they perform advanced risk-based assessments in order to analyze the scope of the HazMat incidents. As you can see in the pictures, those guys are fully kitted. They have their detectors, they have all their gadgets, you know, to keep them safe. They have their breathers on them. And you see in the lower picture, we got the guys with the full HazMat suits, full body HazMat suits, right? They can enter heavily contaminated areas using the highest levels of protection. So like the guys in the blue suits, that would be considered almost like the highest level of protection because there's nowhere where your body is coming into contact with the chemical or with the outside environment, right? So these technicians, HazMat techs, they take offensive actions, right? So for a level like this, we need to use specialized equipment, specialized PPE, as it says. And this is what they have here in the picture. So this is at the level where they enter the place that's heavily contaminated. And as you see the way they dress, you have to really protect yourself. If you notice, this guy is the upper picture. They've got even the gloves taped up with duct tape on the calves of their arms, just to make sure nothing is going in. Everywhere is closed. So technician level responders. Then remember, we have technician with specialty level responders. So these are, again, just more added expertise they have on top there, but this is what they're responsible for. Respond with and support the hazardous material technicians. Again, they possess specialized knowledge of chemical hazards or container characteristics. So if it's a particular, like for example, let's take the example of these wagons here. These are train wagons in the image all here, right? So let's say they're containing ethanol or something like that. So this guy is almost like a subject matter expert. He knows what the ethanol will do if it's heated to that level, or what if it's released to the environment. So you know exactly what to do and exactly what action to take. So they would support the HazMat techs who are going in there, so that to keep them more safe, give them the information they need to do their job. They also provide ongoing monitoring of local environmental conditions, meaning that they have the equipment to be able to focus as they're looking at the weather. They say, okay, maybe the wind is blowing. This cloud of chemicals may be blown into a town. It might affect it. So they do all this monitoring as the incident is going on. So they provide also initial and ongoing survey for the identification and presence of hazardous materials at the search and rescue site. So they are actually just a little bit more than what the HazMat tech would do. Right? And then also, they implement defensive mitigation practices when indicated. So if there's something else that they need to do to prevent it, this would be the guys to go to. Finally, you see there, they direct emergency decontamination procedures for any member of the task force or a victim who was affected. Because remember, the train crash could be in a town. You know, the perfect scenario would be somewhere isolated, but sometimes it never works like that. So it ends up being in a town, in probably next to a school or something like that. Depends on where the railroad is going. So our next one would be the on-scene incident commander, right? His job, these are some of the responsibilities he has. You know, this is not all his responsibilities, but this is just a brief of some of the responsibilities that an incident commander has. So when you look at this just gives you a rough idea of what the incident commander has on his plate. So plan responsive operations with the capabilities and competencies of available personnel, meaning he looks at his guys and says, okay, this is what we have. If we had incident A, then this is how we can respond. Also identify potential action options. So he needs to think, do we do defensive? Do we go offensive? Do we go non-interventional? But again, this is based on what you have on hand, right? Because you can't go defensive and you don't have the equipment to go defensive, or you don't have the PPE to go defensive, right? Again, is to develop a plan of action, which includes safety considerations, and then it also works with the local emergency response plan, also the standard operating procedures, all again, working with the available personnel, the PPE that he has, and also the control equipment, right? So as an incident commander, you still have a lot of things to do, and I'll show you some more as we continue. So again, is to direct resources. So it's kind of like a liaison. You know, you get private companies, governmental and others, NGOs, the environmental agencies, get them all with assignments so that when an incident like this happens, they're able to show up and everybody takes a role and makes the job actually easier, right? So he'll also provide a focal point for information transfer to the media or the local elected officials, because remember, something like this happens, it will be in the news, everybody will want to know what's going on, right? Then remember, through the incident, as it gets on, he'll be to the end where he'll terminate the incident by completing this task below. He'll transfer command control when appropriate, conduct incident debriefing, conduct multi-agency critique. Remember, those are always very important after the incident, where you sit down, right, and talk about what happened and see what could be improved. And remember, when you're leaving the scene, Like now you've put out the incident, you've put out all that, and now what remains is probably for investigators. Your role probably as a firefighter at that point is done, so they'll transfer command. You don't just get in your vehicles and take off, so it's a procedure. So that's what they're talking about. You transfer command and control. Also report and document the hazardous material incident, and then submit the report to a designated entity. So there's also a follow-up of what's going on. So that's just a few of the roles of the incident commander. Right. Now, apart from this, we've got additional personnel that are involved in the incident. Remember, we had talked about the other levels we have. So you've got specialist employees, you've got HazMat officers and HazMat safety officers. These are additional personnel. And remember now, we're in the era of terrorism. So we're looking at also WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, right? They could be either chemical, or any other form that is out there to injure somebody. So that one now has become also part of the process that people need to train for. So these other personnel, right, are also there to support the whole group. But also remember, as an incident commander, you also need to conduct a needs assessment and gap analysis. This helps you look at your department and see, okay, we've got this number of guys and we need this number of equipment to equip us. If we can't get them, can we check? Maybe the next county has equipment that we don't have that they can support us with, because there's no point duplicating the same equipment across all the sites. You guys can work together so you support each other, because some incidences you may need the help of 3 or 4 other departments to come and help you when the incident happens, right? So that's what they're talking about. We need to have cooperation. Yeah, so we talk about what's going to happen, we practice about what's going to happen. So when it does happen, we're able to respond effectively and not get all confused. So some things to consider when you're deciding on a HazMat program. Again, as we talked about earlier, needs assessment and gap analysis results. So you've looked at your department, you say, this is what we need. This is the equipment that we need. How do we get this equipment? Or what can we do to get this equipment? Or is there a different place that this equipment can be obtained? Cost considerations, right? You have one piece of equipment, another county has that same piece or a different piece of equipment. Do we need to buy it, or we could have them assist us when we have this sort of incident? So you put your money elsewhere where it's needed. Again, like we said earlier, duplication of equipment that neighboring jurisdiction or county already has. There's no point in doing that. Get a different one so that you can balance each other out. And it all works with compatibility. You need to help each other to be successful when you have an incident like this. Also, we need to think about certification required to use equipment, right? Some of the equipment, it comes with the training, so you need training to use it. You need to be certified to use this equipment. Again, there'll be costs involved there. Cost to maintain the same equipment. If it's equipment for measuring chemicals, it needs to be calibrated. So all these considerations have to be put in place or have to be taken in or thought about when you're thinking about setting up your HazMat program for your department. All right. So also think about a training program. Remember, because we have awareness, operations, and technicians. So you look at your department and see how many guys do we have who are awareness level, how many do we need on the operations, how many do we need as technicians. That way you're able to balance out what you need, right? So you identify your current abilities and then other plans that you can put in place. And then also remember, as you're doing that as your department, think of what the other agencies that are not within the fire sort of umbrella, like the police, the health department, civil support teams, there's bomb squads, all those other teams can come into play to help you. So when you make your HazMat plan or your HazMat program, remember to consider all these other groups, all these other different agencies that may be able to come in and help you, because some of them may be better equipped than you are. So it would be a good thing to co-opt them into your program. Okay, so again, we're still identifying gaps between required and current capabilities, okay? So we're looking at what we have, what we need, and then what can we do, right? So why this is important, it gives your department, gives you that opportunity to look at your department and see what you have on hand. What resources do we have? What equipment do we have? Do we have an exclusive vehicle just spaced for HazMat, or is it the same fire truck that we use for normal emergencies, right? So again, this is more on the top of the higher level with the fire chief and all those. But once they've determined what the needs are, then you're in a better position now to look for funding or to also present it to the next level up, the next level of leadership, and tell them, okay, we've done a survey of our department. We need A, B, C, D. In our county, we have X number of factories, X number dealing with chemical substances that may be hazardous if there was a fire, and this is what we have. So you've made a basis for your argument so that when you go to the higher ups, then you do have something to talk about or a reason why you need the equipment. Hazardous incidences are very, very different. So we have to remember that they're not like our normal straightforward fires that we go to. Remember, like if it's an oil tanker burning, it may explode several times depending on what chemical or what material was in there, right? So what normally happens at these incidences, the actions taken pretty much depend on what chemicals are involved. Remember, some chemicals are more volatile than others. So they may present a situation where there's not much you can do, you probably have to step back. I saw in the group, somebody posted a video of the electric cars that had were in a crash. And they just kept on exploding. It was, a minute-long video, but there were like several explosions all at once, and this from the electric vehicle. So something like that, again, you really can't go out there and start trying to put it off. Mostly you probably just go a defensive posture, let it probably burn out, just do on the boundary side, just to make sure nothing else is catching fire. So it really depends on what chemicals are involved. Then also the response objectives. The choice of the PPE that you have. Remember, for something like this, there could be chance of getting contaminated. And we talked about this when we're talking about cancer and firefighters. So we have to really be prepared. Incidences like this is when you really need your BA, so just to protect yourself. It's better to assume the worst and, and prepare for it. So remember, for you to plan a response, it begins before the incident actually happens. So this is something you have worked on a departmental level, you have practiced it, you have trained, so that when you get there as a team, you're not falling over each other. Everybody knows what role they're supposed to play. If your role is defensive, then you know that you keep people out, and that's all you do. So it has to start from before. You don't wait till it happens, then you just show up. So remember, when you're planning a response, it starts before it actually happens. So it says there, agencies should conduct incident planning activities at target hazards or other potential problem areas. As we do our surveys around our areas, around our towns, around our cities, we know they have factories. The industrial area, we know we have factories. It's a good thing to, go out there to these factories, see what they have, get to talk to them, see what resources they have that can help you when you show up at that area, so that when you go in there, you don't get surprised or you don't get shocked, So it's a good thing to go ahead of you, before it actually happens, as you do your surveys, as you do your fire inspections. Talk to these guys. It's a lot about community service, talking to the community participation, because if they know what to do, they may be able to help you out and probably stop a major incident from happening, right? So it's up to us again to go out there and educate the population. Another thing we should always think of is also focusing on the real threats that exist in the community. For example, back in Kenya, a couple of years ago, in one of the densely populated areas, there was an oil pipeline that exploded in the middle of the night. And this pipeline exploded and severely burnt so many people, and so many homes were destroyed, right? And at that time, there wasn't really much preparation for an incident like this to happen. So it kind of caught people off guard. It was called the Sinai fire. So if you Google it and look at the Sinai fire, you'll see the images of what happened. There were so many people there who got injured, so much property was damaged, right? So it's things like that where we got to think ahead of it and prepare ourselves for something like that, right? Then also establish parameters to guide the response to these incidences. They should be based on the nature of the chemical, the amount released, and the type of occupancy involved. Now, that would be if it's at the industry itself. You say this factory has probably 300 workers or that sort of thing. So you know how to respond. But the only way you know how to do that is if you've been there and you've talked and you've taken a survey and you've walked around. So that keeps you, it keeps you on the edge, kind of, you know what you're talking about. So let's break down a few of the stuff that we've talked about, right? So the ability of the responders to rapidly recognize the presence of hazardous material is very instrumental in identifying potential risks from materials, right? Selecting our PPE and also determining incidents, priorities, and tactics. So what I think that we're just talking about is we need to be aware that these things are there, but what can we do if this situation, or we get caught up in this situation? So we need to prepare, preparation. Firefighters, we are always preparing, right? It pays to be prepared. And remember also the hazardous material, they pose an unreasonable risk to health, safety of operating emergency personnel. Remember, think about yourself. You're the one responding to this fire. If you're not adequately protected or adequately prepared, the consequences may be deadly on you at an individual level. Recognizing potential hazardous material is very, very critical. It's extremely critical to a firefighter's safety. So it's really important that when we go out to these fires, we pay attention to what's going on. If it's a tanker, let's try and find out what was in the tanker before you actually go in there without your BA and that sort of thing, right? And then you end up in hospital. Then be alert to the possibility of hazardous material, right? So sometimes, for example, again, I like to use the example of the States because there's a lot of incidences there that happen that sometimes is a good learning curve. They have something called methamphetamine. It's a drug that people make. So they have labs in residential houses so that they're not, so that the law enforcement don't know they're there. So they'll be cooking these things in this house. And sometimes the house usually explodes because there's something went wrong in the process of preparing this drug called methamphetamine. So an explosion like that releases this meth into the environment, right? So if you were there as a fireman and you didn't know, by the time you're going through the incident, you're high. So your commander is seeing you start laughing, you've got cross-eyed, they're like, okay, what's going on here? You're literally high from the drugs, right? So it's just something that we need to be aware of. Each fire that we go to, especially sometimes in the residential fires, we don't know what's in somebody's house. So just be careful when you go out there. Always have that in the back of your mind that there could be potentially hazardous materials in this house that we don't know about. For example, now in Kenya, we have some people who in their houses, they have a distillery. So he's brewing whiskey or alcohol in his house that nobody knows about. So he has an illegal brewery or refinery in the house. So you show up to a fire like this and you don't know what's in there, you may end up inhaling some of these chemicals. So as firefighters, again, we need to be able to identify and isolate the released material at the hazardous material incident. So just keeping us aware of what's going on. So be able to know what chemicals may be able to affect us, right? And remember, these hazardous materials, they can be found anywhere. It's not that there's a specific place where you find them. It could be in a house, it could be in a vehicle, it could be somebody in the vehicle is smuggling ethanol or is smuggling some other chemical and it's right there in his vehicle and it explodes. So they could be anywhere. So always be alert, never assume, right? It's better to go there knowing the chemicals, then don't find any chemicals. That way you go there when you're prepared. Again, just a recap of what we did. Regulations are issued and enforced by governmental bodies. Standards are issued by non-governmental entities. Again, hazardous material response begins with the pre-incident planning, meaning before it happens, we're already thinking about it. So then something we can also do, we can use local emergency planning committees. You know, they're probably there at some county level or sub-county level or at the national level. We involve these members in what we are doing because they may have more information on this hazardous material. Because remember, some of the members of the committee are from the hazardous industry themselves or the chemical industries themselves, the paint manufacturers, the glue manufacturers, the rubber manufacturers, all these guys may be members of this committee. So they kind of give you the information you need, or so kind of makes your work a bit easier, right? So then, you know, as usual, you have the media, you have the transportation industry, and we know the transportation industry, they move pretty much everything by road. So again, those are chemicals that may harm us. So it's good to interact. Get this to know these people in the committees. Even you maybe end up being members of these same committees to help your work easier as you respond to these incidents. So we have also hazardous material safety officers there. They ensure the safety of the hazardous material personnel, right? So they make sure the guys who are responding to these things are safe. You've got the right PPE. And also remember, anything that has weapons of mass destruction also has a different procedure for it. That maybe the military may come in, you know, specialized with that. They know what to do. So if you don't involve them in these things, you may end up getting injured. The consequences may be severe for our own firefighters. So it's a really, really wider umbrella that will end up falling under, you know, that we add people to it. So remember, a person who is able to recognize, identify, and notify agencies of the presence of hazardous material is operating on the awareness level, right? So as firefighters, without any other training, if we add it on, would be operating on the awareness level. The public also can operate on the awareness level. So they're able to inform you, the fire department, of what's going on, then you show up there, right? So again, operations level personnel, they respond to hazardous material and also what they call the WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Technician level personnel, this one's now enter the heavily contaminated areas using the full PPE as they show in the picture there. Specialist level personnel also have additional training, right? That's related to specific chemicals, container types, or transportation modes. So these are guys who are on a slightly different level. They know the specific chemicals. They know this one, if it's released into environment, within an hour, it will affect this much people. This is what would happen, that sort of thing. They tell you this kind of container can withstand fire of this much before it explodes. So things like this additional information that is very critical to the firefighters when they show up. And also remember, any hazardous material incident cannot be approached in the same manner as a structural fire. We got to be prepared. We got to be ready, and we never assume that it's just a normal fire, right? And another thing, actions that we take at these incidences, remember, they're dictated by the chemicals involved and also the available resources that you have. Right, so in closing, remember I talked about that Sinai fire where the oil pipeline exploded. It's this picture here, the bottom right-hand side. This was the pipeline right here. And you see the destruction. All these were houses and people living in them. So that's what happened when that exploded in the middle of the night. Killed a lot of people. Some people had extreme burns, that sort of thing. Look it up here in our trailers, with fuel trailers. And we've all had, I believe almost all the countries have had the incidents of where people go to siphon petrol or to siphon a chemical from the tanker, and then it ends up exploding. So we'll never know when our next HazMat incident will occur. So we need to be prepared, we need to be ready, we need to be focused when we go out to deal with these incidences. So stay alert, stay alive, always be prepared, do your work with stride, with pride, and as always, put safety in every stride. Right, thanks a lot, guys.
Okay, at this time, we're going to open up the floor to any questions that you may have. So you can either place your questions in the chat, use the raise hand feature, or just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Question in the chat there, James. Clarify the difference between operations and technician level.
Okay, so I'll just go back here to my slide man here. Okay, so we say the operation level responders here, they're often the professional firefighters when they arrive on the scene, right? Once the 911 call has gone out, these guys, they're pretty much the biggest role here is to analyze the situation, decide if more resources are needed, implement a strategy. Now, once they do that, the next guys who come are the technicians. Now, the technicians will actually go into the building. Remember, we talked about the guys will go into the building, into what's contaminated. That's pretty much the biggest difference there. So your operations guys will be there. They may go in there, turn off the valve to stop more chemicals or more fuel being fed into that fire. Then they'll come back and have that defensive posture as then the technicians come in heavily, suited, ready for action, and they go in there and do their job. So the difference usually is just in the level of training. The technicians have a more advanced training than your operations level responders. I hope that answers the question. Let's see.
Other questions, feel free to unmute, raise your hand.
Yeah, it could be a question, a comment, a suggestion, or yes, I see a question. Sydney, go ahead. You gotta unmute yourself.
Oh, you
There
are.
you go.
Okay, I just want to know, after HazMat technician, what course comes after HazMat technician?
So after the HazMat technician, we call it technician with specialty. So remember, the technician with specialty is where now you deal with probably the characteristics of the chemicals, the characteristics of the containers that contain these chemicals. So you're slightly a level above the technician, as in more in-depth information about the actual chemicals involved in the incident. For example, if there was a train derailed, right? So we have the technicians sorting out the situation. But remember, these guys with the specialties, they're the ones who say, okay, now with this railroad track, we need these wagons, we need to have them cooled down. That's what this chemical at this heat, it will explode, that sort of thing. So they give us more information than we have on the technician level. So they go into slightly like you have bachelors, these guys probably have masters in this sort of thing, if we looked at it in that kind of way. Errol, you had a question? Sydney, I hope that answered your question. Okay. Errol, you had a question?
He's got it in the chat there. Can you please talk to me about decontamination, decon?
Okay, so for example, when after the incident, you have all this, just like when you go to your regular fire, right? But on this one now you have chemicals. So because the chemicals, when you remember, it's all on your turnout gear, all on your fire gears, from your helmet, all over. you're coated with these chemicals. So you can't go back to the firehouse like this. So in this situation, they would have an on-site decontamination station where either it could be, they would put it in a little cube where it has jets of water that hit you, kind of wash you out, and take out any other residue of chemicals that may be on you. And remember, for most of the time, you're going in with a special hazmat suit on there. So when you come out, you get rinsed out, so you don't take these chemicals back to your firehouse, or you don't take these chemicals back to the other population or on you, because it may affect you, right? And these guys who are responsible for the decom, like you're asking there, could be the guys now, you'd have your other guys who are helping you, because you have your specialists, you have your hazmat safety officers. These are the guys who probably end up setting up that station, and then that's where they'll be doing the decontamination, because remember, they're the ones who are responsible for all your PPE and all your equipment out there and keeping you safe. So at the end of the incident, you come through this tent and they get you decontaminated. Maybe somebody has a brush, somebody has a water spray there to hose you down. Now, the Kenyan Army has a thing on YouTube where they show how they're dealing with a hazmat situation. So if I get that video, I'll throw it up on the group so everybody can kind of see it, because they break it down into the different stages and the different groups that they have to deal with this different situation. So I'll look up that video and throw it there probably in the next day or two.
I think it's important to note too, if you get into a situation where you're sort of accidentally dealing with a hazmat incident, you weren't necessarily planning on it, but find yourself in the middle of it, that decontamination, if nothing else, we're doing just what we would call a gross decontamination, where we're just hosing ourselves off with as much water as you can, sort of that, yeah, there's a whole process to decontamination, right? And we want to try to collect the water that we're getting off it, and we'd like to have some sort of a detergent and some sort of brushes, right? But if you don't have access to any of that stuff and you found yourself in that hazmat situation, there's where the basic we can tell you is use the hose line with a fog pattern and wash yourselves down, wash your equipment down with what we would call that gross decontamination. Other questions?
Excellent.
Sydney, you've got your hand raised again there. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to know, because in South Africa, the boots that we used to wear when we go to the fire is the same boots that we wear to go to in a hazardous material. Can they, due to the chemical, maybe acid or hydrochloric acid, might be not suitable for those boots? I just want to know, because we are in grass fire, we're using the same PPE with the same boots, and house fires was using the same boots, the same PPE on a hazardous materials, whereby we only use boots, which is the one that we use to extinguish grass fire and house fires. And they have specific boots for hazardous material.
Yes, they do have on a different level, right? They have specific equipment, what they call for the heavily contaminated areas, right? But remember, like Chief Mike was saying, at the least, if you went out to a fire, not realizing that it was a hazardous fire, and you got all these chemicals on you. Remember, if acid was to pour on you, then it will eat through your suit, because acid is corrosive, and the suits, I know the turnout gear is not designed for acid, to the best of my knowledge, so it will eat into your suit. So that's why we kind of say we need to, when we go out to places like this, we need to be extremely careful. At least have your BA on, so that your face and your sensory organs are at least protected, you know, because your body has a suit on there, which would at least reduce some of that, reduce the chance of that chemical getting to your skin. Because by the time it goes through the first coat, you're already out of there, and then you rinse out with your water. But yes, it would affect your suit, definitely. It may eat away at it because the acid is terrible, though, you know. But I would always say have your face covered, you know, got your beer in there so you're not breathing it in. Then you'd use your water to kind of clear out anything else. I don't know, Chief Mike, you can add on something there?
No, that's good. And yeah, you know, he's asking about the specific, you know, boots and things like that. Certainly there are specific boots that you would use for hazmat that are chemical resistant, won't be, you know, dissolved by some of those chemicals and things like that. Your standard firefighting boots, some of those have a chemical resistant sole. Your standard firefighting boots, of course, are typically made of leather. So those are not ideal in any means for hazmat use. A rubber fire boot's a little bit better to use multi-purpose between hazmat and your firefighting, although once again, not ideal. We never want to discourage you from accomplishing the tasks that you have to. And you guys sometimes have to work with not having the equipment, right? The full Class A suits, the boots, all of that stuff is not readily available for you all. You still have to try to save life and property. So yeah, look at those boots that you've got. The rubber boots are going to be much better if you have to do hazmat and firefighting using the same boot. If you're using the leather, then as James said, the decontamination process. You know, we've got the saying in hazardous materials, right? Dilution is the solution to pollution. So if we do get our boots polluted, right? We get our boots contaminated. The solution to that is to dilute that chemical with lots and lots and lots of water. So I guess that's sort of my advice, to try to get by until you have the access to the appropriate equipment.
Good stuff. Any more questions, guys? Questions, comments? Isaac, how are you doing, sir? Go ahead.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello,
go ahead,
sir.
Isaac.
Okay. I want to find out something. Because I hear, as you were presenting, we are talking of multi-agencies,
Yes.
where you have more than maybe 3 or 4 agencies attending to the incident.
Yes.
So I wanted to find out how is the chain of command like? Who reports to who in that case? Who's supposed to be like more senior, like the overall in charge of the incident? I don't know, you can use maybe an example for any kind of scenario, so that maybe I can get an understanding. And then maybe try to talk about the zoning as well, in line with the HazMat. I think maybe the two, sir, I'll appreciate.
Okay, so for your first one, the chain of command, right? So the first people who get to the scene, right, will take command of the scene. So like if it was the firefighters who got there first, then they will take command of that scene. And as the other agencies come, so you've taken command of the scene, the police show up, the environmental agency shows up, let's say the military shows up. So at that point, depending on what is going on, let's say you go to the point where you've extinguished the initial problem, right? So now what the next level is somewhere more expertise, where now you need like people on the technician level with specialties to go in there and assess what is going on, then now the incident commander will hand over to the next level so these guys can proceed. So it hand over to where he is and then proceed. But again, like we say, all this again is dependent on how well organized or how well planned we've done this. Remember, we need to do it beforehand so that when we get there, people are not jostling for command, right? Because that again becomes a big problem. Everybody says, no, we are more superior than you, then we have no. We are the government, then we need this. You guys are the city level, so that sort of thing. So I always say the first people who come on the scene will start the incident command chain, right? Then the next people who come who are taking over, then the chain keeps on moving, you know, along the level, right? So I hope that really answers that. But remember, for it to work effectively, we got to prepare beforehand. We got to have all these guys on the same page so that when it happens, we're not fighting over it. And, you know, you end up spending time fighting and not dealing with the actual incident. Then you talked about zoning. I don't really understand what you meant by zoning. If you could probably highlight me more on that.
Okay, sorry, maybe before we even come to the zoning,
Yes.
Just there, I asked the question about the chain of command
Yes.
because in most of the cases where you turn out to an incident,
Yes.
then you meet this so-called government officials.
Correct.
Maybe because someone is a general in Zambia army is there, then he tells you, no, do this, do that. Meanwhile, you as a firefighter, you understand the part that you are supposed to play. That's why I asked, so that maybe I can have some more of understanding there as how it is supposed to be. Am I supposed to follow now because this one is the general in Zambia army is telling me, no, you please do that. Meanwhile, I know to say, no, what is telling me to do. Maybe I will even assist to say it is dangerous, it will bring harm to me. So such a confusion arises in most cases. Yeah,
Definitely.
so that's why I've been asked. Yeah.
Okay. And then on the zoning, what were you talking about before I answer that one?
Okay. The zoning. I've heard people talk of zoning, maybe where you have, for example, I can talk of radioactive materials.
Yes.
Where you have the place where the incident is happening. I mean, where the actual maybe material is, maybe where people are supposed to decontaminate, maybe where people are supposed to be so that they are not, they don't come in contact with the radioactive materials. Yeah, something like that.
Okay, and I get you. So we'll first hit the back on the chain of command. So for example, in that scenario, that's a very perfect scenario because that's what would happen. The army general comes and says, okay, I'm taking over this everything going here, I'm taking over this scenario. So in that incident, I would always say, you as a fireman, you have a specific role to play, right? The general will be mostly dealing with, you know, the media and that sort of stuff. But in that scenario, always refer to the chief, your fire chief who would be there with you and say, okay, sir, anything else that we need to do, please go through our chief. So that way you don't get involved in a what you call he said, she said sort of match, shouting match. So you concentrate on what you know to do, extinguishing the fire, keeping that stuff safe. Let the army general do what the army general does, you know, commanding other people around, which they'll do anyway. But that's why we always talked about pre-planning. That's the most, for us to avoid all that, we need pre-planning, you know. Even the army general with pre-planning, he'll understand his role in the chain. Ultimately, he may take overall command, right? Depending on what chemical it is, especially if it's radioactive material or things like that, they may take ultimate command of the scene. But initially, you will be the main guy on the scene doing your extinguishing as you've always done. Then for the zoning one, you're right about there, because what would happen is the area would probably get quarantined, or they would lock down the certain area, right? And then, we talk about being upwind of the, chemicals, so it's not blowing into the responders who are there, trying to get towns evacuated. I assume that's what you're talking about. And then also for all that, again, we have to have these plans in place where we say, if we're evacuating, what is the process? Which route do we follow when we're evacuating? Because if the evacuation route goes through the same contaminated zone, then it's not really serving its purpose. So all this stuff cannot be done exactly when it's happening at the scene. We have to have planned ahead and prepared this situation ahead. If you look at some of the roads back in the States, they would have signs that say evacuation route on it. So these are things that they've prepared beforehand for people to use in case there was an emergency or something going on. So those are some really, really good points you have there, Isaac. Thanks.
We're going to wrap up our formal portion of the class today, and we'll get to your questions in just a moment here. I want to thank James for coming and training again today. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Appreciate everyone taking time out of their schedules and their bundles for joining us for class today. Invite you all to join us again next week at the same time, and we'll see you all again. Thank you very much, everyone.